The sky over the valley turned green, then white, then silent, and Zorath Vey knew that silence was the worst sound a soldier could ever hear. He pressed his back against the broken wall and counted his own heartbeat because it was the only clock he had left. Somewhere behind the smoke, a human voice was calling out a name, over and over, and Zorath understood in that moment that he had learned more about grief from listening to enemies than he ever had from his own people. He did not expect to survive that night. He did not expect, decades later, to be sitting in a quiet room, speaking calmly into a small recording device, telling a stranger everything that had happened. But here he was, an old soldier with pale gray skin and tired eyes, finally ready to talk about the war that changed how his entire species saw the universe. It began, he said, with a promise. The elders of his homeworld told every young recruit that the campaign against Earth would be simple. Humans were described as clever, with tools, but weak in body, quick to fight among themselves, but too disorganized to face a real army. Zorath was 19 cycles old when he signed his name to the recruitment scroll, and he remembered feeling proud, almost lucky, to be chosen for what everyone called a short and glorious mission. Training lasted only a few months. The instructors focused on strength, formation, and obedience. There was no class on human history, no lesson on how people on Earth thought or lived. Zorath asked once why they were not taught more about the enemy, and the instructor laughed and said there was nothing to learn from a species that had not even left its own solar system a century earlier. That answer satisfied him then. It would not satisfy him for long. The journey to Earth took months through open space, and Zorath spent much of it dreaming about the celebration that would greet him when he returned home. He imagined medals, parades, his family standing proudly as he told stories of an easy victory. He practiced speeches in his head. He never once imagined fear. When the fleet entered Earth's orbit, everything still felt distant, almost like a simulation. From above, the planet looked peaceful, blue and white and quiet. It was hard to believe anything living down there could resist an entire invasion fleet. Zorath remembered standing at the viewing deck with a soldier named Torval, a friend he had trained with, both of them staring down at the clouds, neither one saying a word, both trying to hide how nervous they suddenly felt. The first landing happened in a wide, empty field just before sunrise. Zorath's unit expected no resistance for at least a day, based on the intelligence reports. Instead, they were met with organized defensive lines almost immediately. Human soldiers had somehow known exactly where the landing craft would touch down. It was the first sign that everything the recruits had been told was wrong. Zorath remembered the confusion most of all, the sound of unfamiliar equipment, the way human soldiers moved in small, fast groups, instead of the large formations his people expected. A commanding officer nearby shouted orders that made no sense anymore, because nothing about this battlefield matched what they had trained for. Zorath took cover behind a fallen transport vehicle and watched, stunned, as the humans adapted to the invasion within minutes, not days. He remembered one detail clearly, something he had never told anyone before that recording. A young human soldier, barely older than himself, looked directly at him across the smoke and debris. There was no anger in that soldier's face. There was only exhaustion, and something that looked almost like sympathy. It lasted only a second before both of them were pulled back into the chaos, but Zorath said that single look stayed with him for the rest of his life. By midday, Zorath's unit had lost communication with command. Half of his squad had been separated during the fighting, and the survivors gathered in a shallow ditch to wait for new orders that never came. Torval was among them, his uniform torn, his expression blank with disbelief. Nobody spoke about what they had expected before landing. Nobody needed to. That first day taught Zorath something the elders back home had never mentioned. Humans were not simple. They were fast learners, quick to change their plans, and willing to take enormous risks to protect each other. He watched human medics run into dangerous areas to pull their own wounded to safety, ignoring the danger completely. He had been told humans were selfish and divided, yet what he witnessed looked nothing like that at all. As night fell, Zorath's unit retreated to a wooded area outside the main battlefield. They built no fire, afraid it would give away their position. In the darkness, Torvel finally spoke, his voice quiet and shaking slightly. He asked Zorath if this was really what they had trained for. Zorath did not answer. He did not know how. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound in the forest felt like a threat. Every distant light in the sky reminded him how far from home he truly was. He thought about his family, about the parade he had imagined only weeks earlier, and how foolish that dream now felt. The war had barely begun, and already nothing about it matched the story he had been told. When morning came, new orders finally arrived. The commanders back at the main fleet insisted that the previous day had simply been bad luck, an unlucky landing zone, nothing more. They were told the humans would break easily once faced with a larger, more disciplined force. Zorath wanted to believe that. He wanted, more than anything, for the world to make sense again. But a small part of him, quiet and uncertain, had already begun to doubt everything he had been taught. As the second wave of soldiers prepared to move forward, Zorath looked back one final time at the battlefield from the previous day. The ground was scarred and quiet now, empty of the noise and motion that had filled it only hours before. He remembered thinking that whatever this war truly was, it would not be short, and it would not be simple, and by the time it was over, he suspected he would not be the same person who had signed that recruitment scroll back home. He was right, though he would not understand exactly how right for many years to come. The days after that first battle blurred together in a way Zorath found difficult to describe, even decades later. His unit was reorganized twice within a single week, folded into other broken squads until barely anyone recognized the soldiers standing beside them. New officers arrived with new orders, and each set of orders sounded more confident than the last, even as the situation on the ground grew more uncertain by the day. Command insisted that the invasion was still proceeding according to plan, but Zorath noticed the language changing. Words like victory and conquest slowly turned into words like containment and strategic patience. Nobody explained why. Nobody needed to. The soldiers on the ground could feel it long before the officers admitted it out loud. His unit was assigned to a wide stretch of farmland near a small human settlement, tasked with securing a supply route that connected two larger battle zones. It sounded like a simple assignment on paper. In reality, it became one of the longest and most exhausting periods of Zorath's entire life. The humans defending that region were not part of any large organized army. They were, as far as Zorath could tell, a mixture of trained soldiers and ordinary people who had picked up whatever equipment they could find. He remembered watching them from a distance through field lenses, confused by how effectively they worked together despite having so little in common. Farmers stood beside former engineers. Teachers worked alongside trained fighters. They moved with a kind of stubborn determination that no manual back home had prepared him for. One early morning, Zorath's patrol group encountered a young human man near an old stone bridge. The man was alone, unarmed, clearly separated from whatever group he belonged to. For a long moment, nobody moved. Zorath's commanding officer raised a hand, signaling the group to hold position, unsure of what to do with a lone, unarmed civilian standing in open ground. The human did not run. He did not beg. He simply stared back at them with a calm, steady expression, as though he had already accepted whatever was about to happen. Zorath remembered the strange silence of that moment, the wind moving through the tall grass, the sound of distant birds still singing, despite everything happening around them. Eventually, the officer ordered the group to move on without engaging, unwilling to waste time or resources on a single unarmed man. Zorath never learned what happened to him afterward, but he often wondered about it in the years that followed. Encounters like that became more common as the weeks passed. Zorath began to notice a pattern that confused him deeply. The humans fighting against them were not driven by blind hatred, as the recruitment officers back home had claimed. They fought with purpose, with clear reasons, often talking about protecting their families, their homes, their way of life. It was difficult to reconcile that with the description of a savage, disorganized species he had been given before leaving his homeworld. Zorath's closest companion during this period remained Torvel, though even their friendship began to feel strained under the weight of constant uncertainty. Torvel had grown quieter since the first battle, often staring off into the distance during quiet moments, saying very little unless directly spoken to. Zorath understood that silence, because he felt something similar building inside himself, a heaviness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. One evening, while resting near an abandoned barn, Torvel finally opened up about what was troubling him. He admitted that nothing about this war matched what they had been promised. He spoke about a human child he had seen crying beside a destroyed building earlier that week, and how the image would not leave his mind, no matter how hard he tried to push it away. Zorath listened, without interrupting, unsure of what comfort he could offer when he felt the exact same doubts himself. Supply shortages became a serious problem as the campaign dragged on. Equipment that should have arrived weeks earlier never showed up, and rumors spread quickly through the ranks that entire cargo shipments had been lost or destroyed before reaching the surface. Officers refused to confirm or deny these rumors, which only made the soldiers more anxious. Zorath remembered rationing food and water carefully, watching soldiers around him grow thinner and more exhausted with each passing week. Despite these hardships, Command continued sending optimistic reports back to the main fleet, insisting that victory remained close. Zorath began to suspect that these reports had little connection to what was actually happening on the ground. He was not alone in that suspicion. Whispered conversations among soldiers grew more common, quiet moments where doubts were shared carefully, away from the ears of officers who might report such talk as disloyalty. The turning point of this middle stretch of the war came during what should have been a routine patrol near the edge of their assigned territory. Zorath's group was ambushed by a small, well-organized human unit hiding among the ruins of an old farmhouse. The fighting was fast and confusing, and within minutes, half of Zorath's remaining squad had scattered in different directions, cut off from each other entirely. Zorath found himself alone, pressed against a crumbling wall, his equipment damaged, his communication device silent. For the first time since arriving on Earth, he felt truly and completely afraid, not of any specific danger, but of the growing realization that he might not make it back to his own lines at all. It was during this moment of complete isolation that Zorath experienced something he would later describe as the most important event of his entire time on Earth. A young human soldier, moving quickly through the ruins, came around a corner and found Zorath crouched and unarmed, his equipment lost somewhere in the chaos of the ambush. The human soldier, a woman with short dark hair and a face marked by exhaustion, stopped and stared at him for a long moment. Zorath expected the encounter to end immediately and permanently. Instead, the woman lowered her weapon slightly, glancing around to make sure no one else was watching, and then simply walked past him without a word, disappearing back into the ruins as quickly as she had appeared. Zorath sat frozen in place for several minutes afterward, unable to fully process what had just happened. Everything he had been taught insisted that humans would show no mercy to an enemy soldier caught in such a vulnerable position. Yet here was clear proof, undeniable and impossible to explain away, that at least one human had chosen restraint over violence when given the opportunity to act otherwise. That single moment did more to change Zorath's understanding of the war than anything else that had happened up to that point. It was not a grand battle or a dramatic speech from a commanding officer. It was a quiet, almost unnoticed act of mercy from a stranger who had every reason and every opportunity to act differently. He eventually found his way back to what remained of his unit, though nearly a third of the soldiers who had started that patrol never returned. Torvel was among the survivors, and when Zorath told him quietly what had happened near the farmhouse, Torvel simply nodded, saying he had heard similar stories from other soldiers in recent weeks. It seemed Zorath was not the only one beginning to question everything he had been told about the enemy they were fighting. As the weeks turned into months, That quiet questioning spread slowly through the ranks, never spoken openly, but present in the tired eyes of soldiers who had seen far more than any recruitment officer back home could have prepared them for. The war continued. The fighting remained constant, but something fundamental had shifted inside Zorath, a crack in the foundation of everything he once believed to be true. He did not know it then, but that crack would only grow wider in the months ahead, until eventually it would change the entire course of his life. The war entered its second year, and by then, Zorath had stopped counting days the way he once did back home. Time on Earth moved differently for a soldier caught in constant conflict. It was measured instead by battles fought, friends lost, and the slow, steady erosion of everything he had once believed about the mission he had volunteered for. His unit had been reassigned again, this time to a mountainous region far from the open fields where the campaign had first begun. Command described the area as strategically important, a location that would allow greater control over the surrounding territory. To the soldiers on the ground, it simply meant harder terrain, colder nights, and an enemy who seemed to understand these mountains far better than any invading force ever could. Zorath remembered those months as some of the most physically demanding of the entire war. Supplies remained inconsistent, communication with the main fleet grew increasingly unreliable, and morale among the soldiers continued its slow decline. Officers who once spoke confidently about swift victory now spoke carefully, choosing their words with visible hesitation, as though even they no longer believed the reports they were required to deliver. Torvel had changed the most during this period, where he once maintained a quiet optimism despite everything they had witnessed. He now moved through each day with a kind of tired resignation that worried Zorath deeply. They rarely spoke about the future anymore. Conversations that once included plans for returning home eventually faded into silence, replaced by the simple, practical concerns of surviving each individual day. It was during this time that Zorath began to notice something else troubling about the war, something that went beyond the battlefield itself. Reports occasionally reached his unit about actions taken by other Krellin forces in different regions of Earth, actions that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable to discuss. Zorath chose not to dwell on the details, though the unease those reports created stayed with him long after each conversation ended. Meanwhile, the humans defending this mountainous territory proved to be some of the most resourceful fighters Zorath had encountered throughout the entire campaign. They used the natural landscape with remarkable skill, turning narrow passes and hidden valleys into effective defensive positions that neutralized many of the advantages Krellin forces normally relied upon. Zorath found himself developing a strange, cautious respect for these unseen opponents, even as the conflict between them continued without pause. One particular encounter during this period remained clear in Zorath's memory for the rest of his life. His unit had been tasked with securing a narrow mountain pass believed to be an important route for human resupply efforts. The mission required several days of careful movement through difficult terrain, and by the time they reached their target location, exhaustion had settled deeply into every member of the group. As they prepared to establish a defensive position, a small group of human fighters appeared on the ridge above them, clearly having anticipated the Krellin approach long before it happened. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a tense standoff that lasted for nearly an entire day, neither side willing to make the first move, both sides fully aware of the losses such an engagement would bring. During this standoff, something unusual occurred. A human man, older than most of the soldiers Zorath had encountered up to that point, called out across the distance between the two groups, his voice carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. He did not shout threats or demands. Instead, he spoke about the families waiting for both sides back home, about the pointlessness of continued fighting in a place so far removed from any meaningful strategic value. Zorath's commanding officer refused to respond, dismissing the words as a simple attempt at manipulation. Yet Zorath noticed several soldiers around him, exchanging uncertain glances, clearly affected by what they had heard, despite their training to remain unmoved by such appeals. Eventually, both groups withdrew from the pass without engaging directly, an outcome that would have been unthinkable earlier in the campaign, when victory at any cost remained the only acceptable result. That evening, back at their temporary camp, Torval finally spoke about something he had been carrying silently for weeks. He confessed that he no longer believed in the purpose of the mission, that he had begun to see the humans not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a people simply defending everything they had ever known. Zorath listened carefully, recognizing every word as a reflection of thoughts he himself had struggled to fully accept. Their conversation that night marked a quiet turning point between the two friends. They did not speak of rebellion or desertion, knowing the severe consequences such actions would bring. Instead, they simply acknowledged, for the first time openly, that the war they were fighting no longer made sense to either of them, regardless of what their commanders continued to claim. As the mountain campaign continued, Zorath's unit suffered increasingly heavy losses, not from large dramatic battles, but from the slow, grinding pressure of an enemy who refused to be broken despite months of continuous conflict. Soldiers who had survived the earliest days of the invasion began disappearing one by one, some through injury, some through death, and a growing number simply through the psychological weight of a war that seemed to have no clear end in sight. Zorath began keeping a small personal record during this period, brief notes written in a private journal he kept hidden among his equipment. He never intended these notes for anyone else to read, but writing them helped him process experiences that felt too overwhelming to carry silently. He wrote about the human soldier who had shown him mercy months earlier. He wrote about the old man's words on the mountain pass. He wrote, most importantly, about his own growing uncertainty regarding everything he had once accepted without question. The campaign eventually shifted focus once again, moving toward a large, coordinated offensive that Command promised would finally break human resistance in the region permanently. Zorath's unit was assigned a critical role in this operation, tasked with securing a key position that would allow a larger force to advance safely into contested territory. The offensive began at dawn, and within hours, it became clear that once again, the confidence expressed by Command had failed to account for the true capability of the forces they faced. Human defenders had prepared extensively, using knowledge of the terrain and clever tactical positioning to slow the Krellin advance significantly. Zorath's unit found itself pinned down for hours, unable to advance or retreat safely, communication with the broader offensive completely severed. It was during this extended engagement that Torval was seriously injured, caught in the chaos, while attempting to help a fellow soldier reach safer ground. Zorath managed to pull him back to a sheltered position, applying what limited medical training he had, while desperately hoping reinforcements would arrive in time. The hours that followed remained a blur in Zorath's memory, filled with uncertainty, fear, and a desperate need to keep his closest friend alive despite the chaos surrounding them. Eventually, a retreat was ordered, the offensive having failed to achieve its objectives despite the significant resources committed to it. Zorath carried Torval through difficult terrain for what felt like an impossibly long distance, refusing to leave him behind despite the danger such a decision created for himself as well. They eventually reached a secure position, where Torval received proper medical attention and, against difficult odds, survived his injuries. The experience left a lasting impact on both soldiers, further deepening the bond between them, while simultaneously reinforcing the doubts they had both begun to carry regarding the war's true purpose and cost. In the aftermath of that failed offensive, Zorath overheard a conversation between senior officers that he was never meant to hear. They spoke quietly about mounting pressure from the main fleet command, about resources running dangerously low, and about growing concerns regarding troop morale across multiple regions of the ongoing campaign. For the first time, Zorath understood clearly that the war was not simply difficult, it was failing, slowly and steadily, in ways that Command had worked hard to hide from the ordinary soldiers carrying out their orders. This realization did not bring him any sense of relief. Instead, it deepened the exhaustion and uncertainty that had been building within him for months. He began to wonder, quietly and carefully, what would happen when the truth of the situation could no longer be hidden from anyone, soldier and commander alike. That question would soon be answered in ways Zorath could never have fully anticipated, beginning with an event that would change not only the course of the war, but the entire direction of his own life. The capture happened faster than Zorath could have imagined possible. His unit had been separated during a chaotic retreat through dense forest terrain, and within minutes, he found himself completely alone, disoriented, and surrounded by human soldiers who had clearly been tracking his movements for some time before making themselves known. He expected the worst. Every warning given to him during training suggested that capture meant the end, one way or another. Instead, the human soldiers approached him with careful, controlled movements, securing his equipment without unnecessary force, speaking to each other in calm, professional tones that surprised him given the circumstances. Zorath was transported to a human field camp located somewhere in the surrounding hills, though he lost track of the exact route taken to reach it. The camp itself surprised him from the moment he arrived. He had expected something harsh and threatening, matching the descriptions given by his own commanders. Instead, he found an organized, functional facility, staffed by soldiers and civilians working together with quiet efficiency. His first days in the camp were filled with uncertainty and fear, despite the relatively calm treatment he received. He was questioned regularly by officers seeking information about troop movements and strategic plans, though Zorath quickly noticed that these interrogations lacked the harshness he had been warned to expect. Questions were asked directly, answers were noted carefully, and when Zorath chose not to respond to certain inquiries, no punishment followed. A woman named Grace Sullivan oversaw much of his early questioning, and over time, their interactions shifted from formal interrogation into something closer to genuine conversation. She asked about his life before the war, about his family, about what he had believed regarding humans before ever setting foot on Earth. Zorath answered honestly, finding a strange relief in finally speaking openly about thoughts he had kept hidden for so long. Grace, in turn, shared details about her own life, about the community she had left behind to join the defense effort, about the losses her family had suffered since the invasion began. Zorath listened carefully, struck by how similar her experiences sounded to his own, despite everything he had been taught about the fundamental differences between their two species. Over the following weeks, Zorath's understanding of human culture deepened considerably. He observed daily routines within the camp, noticing the small acts of kindness exchanged between soldiers, the quiet moments of humor shared even during difficult times, the deep sense of loyalty that bound this diverse group of people together, despite their many differences. A man named Oliver Bright, a medic assigned to the camp, took particular interest in Zorath's physical well-being, ensuring he received proper care despite his status as a captured enemy soldier. Oliver often spoke casually while tending to Zorath's minor injuries, sharing stories about his life before the war, about his hopes for what might come after the conflict finally ended. These conversations, simple and unguarded, continued to challenge everything Zorath had once believed about the people he had been sent to fight. One evening, while sitting near the edge of the camp, under careful but respectful supervision, Zorath found himself in conversation with a young soldier named Nathan Price. Nathan was curious about Krellin culture, asking thoughtful questions about traditions, family structures, and daily life back on Zorath's homeworld. Zorath answered as best he could, surprised by how genuinely interested Nathan seemed, given that their two peoples remained locked in active conflict. Nathan eventually admitted that he had lost a close friend early in the war, and that for a long time he had struggled with intense anger toward every Krellin soldier he encountered. He explained, quietly and honestly, that spending time near Zorath had forced him to reconsider some of those feelings, recognizing that the ordinary soldiers fighting this war were often just as trapped by circumstances as he was himself. These conversations, accumulating slowly over the following weeks, began to reshape Zorath's entire perspective on the war. He no longer saw the conflict simply as a battle between two opposing species. Instead, he began to understand it as a tragedy, shaped by fear, misunderstanding, and decisions made by leaders on both sides who had never taken the time to truly understand who they were fighting against. A particularly significant moment occurred when Zorath was allowed limited access to communication records from within the camp, part of an effort by human officers to demonstrate transparency regarding the treatment of captured soldiers. Among these records, Zorath discovered detailed accounts describing failed attempts by human leadership to establish peaceful communication with Krellin Command in the early stages of the invasion. Every attempt, it seemed, had been ignored or dismissed entirely by his own people. This discovery struck Zorath deeply. He had always assumed the ongoing conflict was unavoidable, a natural result of two different species encountering each other under difficult circumstances. Learning that genuine efforts toward peaceful resolution had been made and rejected forced him to reconsider everything he had believed about the necessity of continued fighting. Grace Sullivan, noticing the impact this discovery had on him, spoke with Zorath at length about the possibility of change, about efforts within various human communities to seek alternative solutions beyond continued warfare. She explained that many people, exhausted by years of conflict, had begun quietly working toward finding common ground, even as official channels remained locked in ongoing hostility. Zorath began to see his time in the camp not as a period of captivity, but as an unexpected opportunity to understand a perspective he had never been given access to before. He found himself increasingly reluctant to think about returning to his own forces, uncertain of how he could continue fighting a war he no longer believed served any meaningful purpose. During one particularly memorable evening, the camp gathered for a simple meal, and Zorath was invited to join, an invitation that surprised him given his status. He sat quietly among soldiers and civilians alike, listening to easy conversation and gentle laughter that filled the space despite the ongoing hardships surrounding them all. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Zorath felt something close to peace, a strange and unexpected feeling given the circumstances that had brought him there. Oliver Bright, sitting nearby, noticed Zorath's quiet reflection and asked gently what he was thinking about. Zorath admitted, honestly and without hesitation, that he no longer knew what he believed about the war, about his role in it, or about what would happen to him once his time in the camp eventually came to an end. Oliver offered no easy answers, only quiet understanding, acknowledging that many people around him carried similar uncertainty regarding the future. As weeks turned into months, Zorath's presence within the camp became less that of a prisoner and more that of a reluctant guest, caught between two worlds he no longer fully belonged to. He assisted occasionally with small tasks around the camp. Careful conversations continued to deepen his understanding of human resilience and compassion, and slowly, the fear that had once defined his perception of humanity faded into something far more complicated and far more human than he ever could have imagined. It was during this period of quiet transformation that news arrived, unexpected and significant, that would soon determine the next chapter of Zorath's extraordinary journey, one that would ultimately lead him toward decisions neither he nor anyone around him could have fully predicted when the war first began. Word of a ceasefire arrived quietly, without the dramatic announcements Zorath might have once expected from such a significant development. Grace Sullivan delivered the news personally, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and cautious uncertainty that mirrored exactly how Zorath himself felt upon hearing it. Negotiations, it turned out, had been ongoing for months through careful, secretive channels established between exhausted leaders on both sides who had finally recognized the unsustainable cost of continued fighting. Zorath learned that reports similar to the ones he had overheard after the failed mountain offensive had eventually reached decision-makers within his own government, forcing a reconsideration of the entire campaign that had once seemed so certain of success. The terms of the ceasefire were complicated, involving lengthy discussions about troop withdrawal, prisoner exchanges, and cautious steps toward future communication between the two species. Zorath, along with several other captured soldiers held within various human camps, was informed that repatriation would begin within a matter of weeks, allowing them to return home for the first time since the invasion had begun. The news should have filled him with joy, and in some ways, it did. Yet Zorath found himself experiencing a complicated mixture of emotions he struggled to fully understand. The camp, once viewed as a place of captivity, had become something closer to a second home, filled with people who had shown him unexpected kindness during one of the most difficult periods of his life. The idea of leaving, of returning to a homeworld and a life that now felt distant and unfamiliar, created a strange sense of loss alongside the relief he knew he should be feeling. In the days leading up to his departure, Zorath spent as much time as possible with the people who had shaped his understanding of humanity so profoundly. Grace Sullivan shared final conversations with him about hope for the future, about the importance of voices like his own in helping bridge the gap between two peoples who had caused each other so much pain through fear and misunderstanding. Oliver Bright, ever practical, ensured Zorath received proper medical clearance for the journey home, while also taking time to express genuine well wishes for whatever life awaited him beyond the war. Nathan Price, the young soldier who had once struggled with deep anger toward every Krellin he encountered, offered a quiet, sincere farewell, admitting that knowing Zorath had changed his perspective in ways he never expected possible. The day of departure arrived with mixed emotions filling the camp. Zorath stood at the edge of the encampment one final time, looking out over the landscape that had witnessed so much of his personal transformation. He thought about the young human soldier who had spared his life during that chaotic ambush months earlier, wondering if she would ever know the profound impact that single choice had made on the course of his entire life. The journey back to his own forces felt surreal, filled with quiet reflection, rather than the excitement he might have once expected from such a moment. When he finally rejoined remaining Krellin units preparing for withdrawal, he found many soldiers similarly changed, carrying quiet doubts and unspoken questions about everything they had experienced during the long, difficult campaign. Torval, who had survived his injuries and remained with the withdrawing forces, greeted Zorath with quiet relief, both friends recognizing immediately that neither of them were the same soldiers who had first landed on Earth years earlier. They spoke little about specific events during the journey home, the weight of everything they had witnessed still too heavy for easy conversation, though the understanding between them remained clear without needing words. The return home brought its own unexpected challenges. Zorath found himself struggling to reconcile his personal experiences with the official narrative still being presented by government leaders back on his homeworld. Public statements continued, describing the war as a difficult but honorable campaign, carefully avoiding any real acknowledgement of the doubts and failures that had defined so much of the actual conflict. For a long time, Zorath remained silent about his experiences, uncertain of how his story would be received by a society that had been fed a very different version of events. He returned to civilian life quietly, taking on ordinary work, avoiding public discussions about the war whenever possible, carrying his memories privately while attempting to build a new life, separate from everything he had witnessed. It took many years before Zorath felt ready to speak openly about his experiences. The decision came gradually, encouraged in part by growing efforts within his own society to better understand the true history of the conflict, efforts led by returning veterans who, like Zorath, had grown tired of watching their experiences erased by comfortable, simplified official narratives. He began sharing his story cautiously at first, speaking with small groups of fellow veterans who understood intimately the complicated emotions he carried. Slowly, as more voices joined together, a broader public conversation began to emerge, one that finally acknowledged the true cost and complexity of a war that had been sold to an entire generation as something simple and righteous. Zorath eventually reconnected with Grace Sullivan through newly established communication channels between the two species, channels that had grown steadily since the ceasefire first took effect. Their conversations, though limited by distance and circumstance, continued to reinforce everything Zorath had come to believe during his time in her camp all those years earlier. Humanity, much like his own people, was neither simply good nor simply bad, but complicated, resilient, and capable of extraordinary compassion even amid extraordinary hardship. Reflecting on his entire journey, Zorath often returned to a single central thought whenever he shared his story publicly. The war had not been fought because humans and Krellans were fundamentally incapable of understanding each other. It had been fought because both sides had allowed fear and assumption to replace curiosity and communication, a mistake that cost countless lives on both sides before anyone was willing to admit the truth. He spoke often about the importance of remembering individual moments of humanity, found even within the chaos of war. The mercy shown by a stranger during a desperate ambush, the quiet kindness of a medic tending to an enemy's wounds, the simple, shared meal that reminded him people were people, regardless of the world they came from. Now, sitting in that quiet recording room, having finally shared his complete story after so many years of silence, Zorath felt a sense of peace he had not expected to find. He hoped, more than anything, that his experience might serve as a reminder for future generations, a warning against blind assumption and unnecessary conflict, and a tribute to the unexpected friendships that had emerged from one of the most difficult periods in both their histories. As he concluded his story, Zorath spoke one final thought that seemed to summarize everything he had learned throughout his long and difficult journey. True strength, he said, was not found in the ability to defeat an enemy, but in the willingness to understand them, even when everything around you insisted such understanding was impossible. With that, the recording ended, leaving behind not just the account of a war fought long ago, but a lasting reminder of the humanity that could be found, even in the most unlikely and unexpected of places.